All right. So Julia Broussard, I think I butchered it again.
You're good.
I am so sorry, is the Assistant Provost for Title IX Compliance and Education at and the Title IX Coordinator at Tulane University. In this role, Julia serves as Tulane's response to Title IX complaints and maintains initiatives to sustain a safe climate for all university community members, free from sex discrimination, sexual harassment, and sexual violence. Julia previously worked in case management and victim support services at Tulane and has been employed with Tulane since 2012. Julia also serves as a research affiliate with the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention and Research and Education at the University of Utah. She holds a bachelor's degree from Tulane University, a master's degree in social work, woohoo, go social workers, from
Yeah.
Louisiana State University, and a clinical social work license. And without further ado, Julia.
All right. Thank you so much, Melissa, for the intro. And just thank you to Melissa, Liz, and Latanya, who are in the background helping keep me organized. I'm really excited to get to talk to y'all today. And just a couple of things I'm going to highlight from my bio because they're relevant to the context that I bring to this work. So I currently serve as a Title IX coordinator at Tulane University and have been in our Title IX office here since 2018, but for 6 years prior to that, served in our case management and victim services office here at Tulane, which in its current iteration works with both victims and respondents. And so when I was in that role, I had a lot of experience working with victims from an advocacy side, but also working with respondents from a case management side. And that definitely informs my interest in this work, which I engaged in through the University of Utah as a research fellow there. So I have just a couple of acknowledgments I want to make before we kind of dive into the content of today's session. Um, there we go. The first one is just a land acknowledgement. I live and work in New Orleans, which is a continuation of an indigenous trade hub on the Mississippi River, known for thousands of years as Bulbancha. Excuse me, y'all. And then, as I mentioned, this research was done through the University of Utah. And I want to acknowledge that University of Utah occupies the land of the Bannock, Goshute, Navajo, Paiute, Shoshone, and Ute peoples. Additionally, I want to provide some context for the McCluskey Center that this research was centered out of. Um, in the fall of 2018, Lauren McCluskey, an undergraduate student at the University of Utah, was murdered on campus by a man she had briefly dated. And in the aftermath of this tragedy, campus community members came together to find a way to address and prevent sexual and relationship violence. And one of those strategies was the creation of the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention in 2020. That same academic year, Dr. Sarah Howley, a medical resident on the health sciences campus, was murdered by her partner in their home. And Mackenzie Luke was murdered by someone she met on a dating site that summer as well. And then in February 2022, Chi Fan Dong, an undergraduate student, was murdered by a man that she dated. So I think it's really important that we uplift the legacies of these women and all of the survivors that really are at the center of this work we do to respond to and prevent sexual violence. Finally, I want to acknowledge our research team, which is just an incredible group of people. I'm here presenting solo today, but I am presenting on behalf of this wonderful team that's led by Dr. Chris Linder and Dr. Nadika Karunaratne. And then myself, Dr. Adrian A.J. Jackson, Dr. Megan Carbley, Libna Noor, and April Pavelka are part of this research team that was a mix of scholars and practitioners. And that was one thing that I really valued about this team is that we had a lot of folks who, like me, serve in roles on campus doing direct response and prevention work. And then some folks who are really some experts on kind of the research and more scholarship side of this. So it was just a great group of people to get to do this research project with. Okay, I'm so sorry for the coughing. I'm gonna take a sip of water. If you haven't already, there is a poll in Whova. You can fill out all four now if you want, but we're going to kind of look at them at specific times. There's one that says, just do you work with respondents in your current role? And let me look at the results so far if you haven't already. I see some results rolling in. Love that. We're up to 19 responses, 21 responses. So it looks like there's a handful of people in here who work directly with respondents, and then maybe a lot of folks, it looks like a lot of folks like me, where in my day-to-day job, I'm not often sitting down directly with respondents and working with them, but I'm working really closely with my colleagues, who are working with them through investigations or through case management services for those respondents or through some of the clinical interventions that here at Tulane we are able to sometimes connect our respondents with. Um, so I'm glad to see that the majority of folks here either are working directly with respondents or working really closely with maybe the offices or colleagues that do. And then I see a couple folks who don't work with respondents at all, but maybe are interested. I'm going to assume maybe you're interested in getting this kind of work on your campus, or just interested in learning more about this. So I appreciate y'all completing that just to give me a little bit of a sense of who's in the room. Okay. So our goals for today are, by the end of this session, I hope y'all can describe at least three ways respondent professionals or respondents who work, oh, I'm sorry, professionals who work with respondents experience their work. Identify at least one strategy for supporting these folks who do work with respondents, especially for those of y'all who are on campuses where that work is happening. And then finally, describe that difference between accountability and punishment, because that's an important theme that comes up in this work. So, our research team came together in 2023. The McCluskey Center put out a call for folks who were interested in engaging in this research. And we started meeting monthly on Zoom starting in May 2023. We looked at the scholarship around work with respondents. We kind of brought to the table our own positionalities and experiences, and came up with the specific kind of purpose and research questions for this study. And we found that, this is a relatively new area of research. There's not a lot out there. There's little guidance that exists for practitioners engaging in this work. There can be some stigma around this work. There's not always a clean roadmap for how we do this, right? So we felt like we needed a study, one, just to kind of understand, like, who's out there doing this work? What does this work look like? How do folks conceptualize this work? What are some of the kind of maybe theories or philosophies, if any, that are guiding this? Um, how do they see their work as contributing to ultimately preventing sexual misconduct? What are the tools that they might need to better do this work? And so we've centered in on these two kind of central research questions of who is doing this work and how are they doing it? We put out calls for participants to participate in this study through a lot of professional networks. So things like ATICSA, which is the Association for Title IX Administrators, NASPA, which is the Professional Association for Student Affairs Professionals, ASCA, which is the one for conduct professionals, MASOC, which is a organization for folks who more broadly, not just in higher ed, but anyone who's working with folks who have engaged in some form of sexual offending or harm. And then also just through like kind of individual networks, looking on the AAU website at which member institutions list that they provide respondent services, or I'm sorry, looking on AAU member institutes websites to see who lists respondent services. And we ended up with 24 folks who agreed to do interviews with us. Those interviews lasted about 45 to 60 minutes on Zoom with a member of the research team. And these are the types of questions we asked. We wanted to know about their background, why or how they had kind of ended up working with respondents, what guides their work, were there any philosophies that they were employing? Tell us about a typical initial meeting with a student. Tell us about a time you felt like you had an aha moment or a learning moment with a respondent you were working with. What's challenging about this work? What's rewarding? Where are you getting support for this work? And in what ways do you maybe feel unsupported? And those questions really yielded some really rich conversations. Um, so let's dive into just the demographics of the folks who participated in this study. Um, this is maybe not surprising, but a majority of the folks we interviewed were women, although there are a significant chunk of men that we chatted with, and then a participant who identified as non-binary. Majority of the participants were identified as white, little over half, with the rest of the participants identifying as Black or African American, Latine, multiracial, or Native American. Majority of participants also identified as heterosexual, although we had 9 who identified as queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual. And then about 3/4 of participants identified as non-disabled, with about a quarter identifying as disabled. And then finally, in looking at institution type, we primarily had participants who worked at large public institutions. Um, and then with about a quarter either being at a private institution or a mid-sized public institution. And we found that this work is happening in a lot of different places on campus. So there were a significant number, about 10 participants said, their work was housed either in a dean of students or like an office of student conduct. That was followed by 6 participants who their work was housed in a Title IX office. And then 4 who worked in maybe like a general student support or case management office. And then another 4 who were in an office that was specifically designated for sexual assault prevention and response. So, our process for getting our data for this study is that after each participant was interviewed, we transcribed the recorded interviews using AI, and then a team member who was not the same person that did the interview listened to that recording of the interview with the AI transcript in front of them and went through to kind of correct any errors and also remove any kind of identifying information that might have been in that transcript. Um, and then we had the 5 members of the research team came together with the transcripts through a process of listening, annotating, and memoing that Wolgamuth et al. Described in their book, Expanding Thematic Approaches to Analysis. And after folks had reviewed at least 2 transcripts, they developed tags to kind of categorize the data. So tags like purpose and philosophy of working with respondents, journeys to the work, logistics of the work, challenges and constraints of the work. And then we had another 2 researchers who were not the person who conducted the interview or the person who transcribed the interview. We had those 2 researchers go through and tag each transcript. Um, and so this was kind of the process we went through. It involved multiple people to try to kind of make sense of the themes that were emerging from these interviews. Um, and so let's chat about what some of those themes were. So we're going to walk through like who is doing this work, kind of how did they get here, how are they doing this work, and in what context are they doing this work? Let me pause for water for a sec. Okay. So one of the things we asked about was kind of what was the background that led you to this work? And maybe not surprisingly, a majority of folks, 11 participants, um, came to this work through a fairly traditional higher ed background. So they had worked in housing or conduct or fraternity and sorority programs, something like that, that gave them maybe some exposure to, adjudicating misconduct or working with respondents, in that respect. We also had some folks who had law degrees and had ended up in higher ed through that route, or folks like me who have a MSW or background in social work and came to higher ed through this route. And then a couple folks who had done kind of systems work previously, 5 folks who said they had a background in doing like victim advocacy in the rape crisis or domestic violence world, out in the community prior to transitioning to higher ed and research tech. And then one who is a research tech. So you can see we've got a variety of backgrounds doing this work, which is not necessarily, good or bad. It's just interesting to note that I think because this is such a new field, And there's not kind of a clear pathway to this work. We see people from a variety of different pathways finding themselves in this work. We also asked about folks' personal relationships to violence or oppression, or that theme emerged in the data. And we did have some folks who self-identified as being either a primary or secondary survivor of some form of interpersonal violence, like sexual assault or dating or domestic violence. A lot of folks who identified that just they personally brought a lens of equity or social justice, anti-oppression, and healing to this work. And then again, folks who had a background previously in housing or conduct or some kind of area on campus where they were already interacting with or had prior experience working with respondents in that kind of realm. Um, we asked folks about what did they see as their role in doing this work with respondents, and we had a variety of different themes come up. So one was that we asked them about like how do folks get referred to you? And there's kind of a variety of pathways that folks shared about how they get respondents referred to them to work with them. And so I have a quote from one of our participants, Joe, pseudonym, that illustrates this. Joe said, "So I would say by and large, it was one of two things. It was either that they had received feedback from someone, like someone had had a conversation with them about either the survivor themselves or friends of the survivor, or both of them were like, hey, I don't know if you know this, but like so and so says that you assaulted them. Or I don't know if you know this, but like you have a terrible understanding of consent." And so they had like received this feedback and were like, F, what do I do? And they came to me. Or they got referred to an RA or a student group leader or an athletic team leader who was like, hey, there's this chatter about you. I think you need to go talk to Joe about this. So Joe really highlights, a lot of times it's their peers, maybe literally just their friends or a peer who's in more of a leadership role saying, ooh, I think you need to go talk with this person because I'm noticing I've got some concerns about you. Or someone is saying, you harmed me or you harmed my friend. I think you need to go talk to this person. But folks also talked about getting referrals from like Title IX offices, student conduct, kind of care systems that are set up on campus. Um, whether that's maybe like a case management office or weekly meetings of a more formalized, maybe care team, or I know they go by different names on campuses. Um, Interestingly, another theme that emerged is a lot of folks were defining their roles in terms of what they're not. So this was a theme that came up with a lot of different interviews where folks are going, I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm not that. And I have another quote from Joe here that illustrates that. Joe says, I'm not a clinician. I don't have a clinical background. I'm not a therapist. And so I'm really, really careful that I am not a treatment provider. That is not the work that I see myself as doing. I am a really good fit for situations where a person has had really terrible messaging about masculinity and has had really terrible messaging about intersections between substance use and sexuality. I had a couple people who had gotten rabbit holed by incel content on the internet, right? And needing some help pulling that apart. I'm much more in circumstances where a more like cognitive skills-based approach is appropriate. That's where my value is, but I'm not a treatment provider. And I had another participant who similarly kind of got into this I'm not framing. Summer said, I'm not a judge, I'm not a cop. So that was a theme that emerged that folks were trying to be really clear with students about kind of the boundaries of what their role is and isn't. Um, we also had, a theme of part of people's role was to kind of, Morgan said, be a tour guide through this process. So if students are going through a formal or informal adjudication process or resolution process, um, they're there, these folks who are working with respondents are often there to kind of help them understand that process. And again, like Morgan said, be a tour guide, help them understand what's happening, what next steps are, what their role is. We also had a lot of folks say, in a similar vein, part of my process is to kind of explain and review our policy with them, review with them the definition of sexual assault, and maybe help them see their behavior through the lens of that definition. Folks talked about having to kind of put boundaries and walls up around what happened, and also some of the emotion that the respondents would express in their interactions with them. Um, And so I have a quote from Morgan to illustrate that. Morgan said, "The hardest part for me is when I'm meeting with the student, whether it's the first time or the fifth time, and they see me as their support person. They want to debate and rehash and argue what happened and how that person's wrong, that person's crazy, that person that they're lying." And I'm like, we're not here to talk about that. I will shut them down very quickly and say, no, I'm not here to talk about what happened in the past. And they just want to kind of express all of these emotions, all of these challenges. They want to share that they've been wronged, that they are the victim. And it's not my place to know or to determine whether or not anything is true. I am not the decision maker in these proceedings, nor do I want to be, but I have to hear that and listen to that and very intentionally put up a wall. I set up a very structured meeting with them, the first one to make sure that I avoid that as much as possible. So the hardest part for me is trying to manage their emotions and keeping that boundary up as a professional. And then later on, Joe goes on to say, I'm not their defense attorney. I'm not their counselor. I'm not their friend. I'm their process guidance. And so I think that's helpful again for illustrating some of these themes around folks feel like they have to be very clear, I'm not this, I'm not that. And put up these boundaries maybe around things that the respondent wants to discuss with them, particularly around kind of hashing out like, oh, well, here's what really happened, or I was the one who was wronged here. um, Folks are having to put boundaries up around to kind of manage that. And then finally, we had a lot of folks who also identified their role is to provide psychosocial education, whether that's maybe a really formal curriculum like the STARSA curriculum, if any of y'all are familiar with that. We use that here at Tulane. It was a curriculum that was specifically developed to work with college students who had engaged in some form of sexual harm. But a lot of folks, it sounds like, are also, they're maybe not using a formal curriculum like STARSA, but they are still engaging in a lot of psychosocial education with folks. As you kind of heard from Jo, she was talking about she had a student who went down a rabbit hole with incel content, and her part of her role was helping that student unpack that and kind of unlearn that, right? And then in some cases, folks are doing this psychosocial education because they're also part of a reintegration program for a respondent who has maybe gone through a conduct process and is now reintegrating back into the community. In terms of philosophies that folks are employing in this work, we found four big themes. One around kind of equity in terms of equity for complainants and respondents within a Title IX or conduct process, another around wanting to support education, learning, and growth for respondents. A third theme around, seeing the humanity in respondents and having compassion for them. And then finally, a philosophy around healing for respondents. And so I'll start with the policy and equity and processes. As some of y'all may know, in the 2020 Title IX regulations explicitly said that we need to provide support for both respondents and complainants throughout the process. And I think some schools were already kind of doing that prior to 2020, but it really put kind of firmly in the Title IX compliance requirements that we need to have some level of support for respondents who are going through that process. And those 2020 regulations really put an emphasis on making sure that processes and supports are equitable for respondents and complainants. And so a lot of schools kind of either put in place respondent services that they didn't have before, or retooled or ramped up respondent services if they had some existing ones, with this concern around ensuring that there was equity. And Morgan has a quote that illustrates that. Morgan said, "So in our process, complainants have access to a victim advocate. They can use that advocate if they want. They're given all kinds of resources, as they should have access to. And before the program, before this position, referring to Morgan's position, was created, respondents didn't get anything. I mean, they were given notice and that was it." And I was like, oh, that's really strange. Why would it not be equal? So again, that was a theme that came up around wanting to ensure that both students had support through any kind of Title IX or, formal resolution or adjudication process that was happening. Um, as I mentioned, that education, learning, and growth was a huge theme, maybe not surprisingly for folks who work in higher ed. this is a theme that really aligns with our larger goals as institutions of higher education. You know, a lot of folks are working in a maybe student affairs context where that's also a really kind of explicit part of student affairs values. And so I have a quote from Lisa that illustrates this. Lisa said, "I hope that these processes are not seen as punitive, but that they are seen as an opportunity for learning and for growth, for personal reflection and change in behavior. I feel like that is very much in alignment with the purpose of higher education institutions in general. We're meant to be institutions of higher learning and the personal development and growth that happens at the same time. I hope that's what we're doing within our colleges and universities, is setting up a process where it's an opportunity to learn and grow." And then kind of hand in hand in that, you know, if we're invested in someone's learning and growth, um, it's kind of implicit that we have to see the humanity in that person and have some compassion for them, right? And so Elizabeth said, I think that we have to acknowledge that maybe someone has caused harm. And certainly I've worked with respondents who have caused, like, I know they have caused significant harm, right? And they are still a whole person and they're deserving of the compassion that I can give. And that compassion doesn't necessarily mean that there's not accountability for that, right? But I'm not going to write them off as a lost cause because, you know, the more like there is a possibility, right, where they could learn from listening and really engage with it. Um, so again, in that quote from Elizabeth, you're seeing some themes around learning and growth and also the importance that we need to acknowledge the humanity of the folks who engage in this harm. We're still absolutely holding space for you have caused harm and we need to address that. But also I see you as a person who's deserving of compassion. And then finally, there was a theme around healing, and I'm going to put this full quote up on the next slide from Gray because I think it's Gray really gets into this theme in a really powerful way. Gray says, I work 99% with men, and we have a high rate of men of color as well. And so, like, the acknowledgement that there is an identity set of the mental health behind being a respondent, the mental health of going through an investigation, the lack of support that you have, one as a man, two as a man of color. I was just at a restorative justice training for sexual misconduct last week, and we talked a lot about that restorative justice provides, specifically in terms of sexual misconduct, provides a space for healing to those who think that they don't deserve it. I see a lot of respondents who don't believe that they're worthy of conversation and don't believe that they're worthy of being human and being treated like that. And to sit with someone in that pain that no one else will acknowledge with them, I think just feels so purposeful. I absolutely loved my time working with respondents and got to experience their healing. And I think when you experience someone else's healing, it's a very powerful moment to bear witness to. And so I think working with respondents, I get to bear witness to their journeys. I get to bear witness to their healing, to their growth, to their learning, to their acknowledgement of accountability and responsibility. And I get to facilitate that. I see it as a privilege and an honor. And so I think that quote from Gray not only encapsulates that theme around healing, right, but the themes around having compassion for them, acknowledging their humanity, and being invested in their growth and learning. And also touches on this theme around um, you know, we absolutely need to prioritize the first priority is the healing, right, of the person who's harmed, but oftentimes in processes like at restorative justice, we can also have healing and learning and growth for the person who caused harm, and how those two kind of work together in a process like that. Okay. So we also asked folks around what kind of education and training did they get for this role of working with respondents. And again, not surprisingly, we're kind of seeing folks getting this education and training from a variety of different places because this field is so relatively new. You know, as far as I know, there's not like a professional association that exists right now for folks who are working with respondents that can kind of function as a centralized hub for getting this education and training. So we did have folks mention some of those kind of related professional associations like ASCA for conduct professionals, NASPA for student affairs professionals, ATICSA for Title IX professionals as places where they were getting some of this education. They also talked about community or state sexual assault and DV advocate training. So, like, I know I'm in Louisiana, we have our state coalition against sexual assault and our state coalition against domestic violence, and they oversee the advocacy training that our community victim service providers like rape crisis centers and DV shelters have their advocates go through. And there were some folks who participated in this that found that kind of training valuable, even though it's very much focused on working with victims. Some of those pieces of that training may be around understanding the dynamics of sexual assault or intimate partner violence, or how to work with folks in a trauma-informed way they felt were transferable to their experience with respondents. Folks also talked about like the need to stay up to date on campus resources and policies. I was referencing those 2020 Title IX regulations earlier. And as folks who work in this field probably know, we've had a lot of up and downs with what the Title IX policies are going to be over the past few years. And so folks said it was really important for them to be up to date on those policies kind of at the national level and how that translated down to their campus level, especially when you consider that folks were saying part of my role is to be kind of a guide for a student through a process, right? I need to be up to date on that and help students understand, maybe what's behind this specific piece of our process and how that connects maybe to larger national policy. Folks also talked about a variety of campus-based trainings that they had gotten that, again, weren't necessarily directly focused on working with respondents, but had some really valuable pieces that informed this work. So things like DEI trainings, maybe helping them understand about working with respondents from different identities and backgrounds, mental health and trainings like QPR, which is a suicide intervention training, can be really valuable when you're working with respondents, trauma-informed support trainings, and also threat assessment trainings. Although one participant, Joe, noted, quote, there's a huge disconnect between behavioral intervention and student at-risk teams and people with actual knowledge of what constitutes risk from a respondent. So we're seeing a gap in that we may have, folks on our campus who are kind of charged with threat assessment, but they're not always trained specifically in threat assessment for college students who are engaging in sexual assault or intimate partner violence. And then finally, our participants talked about reading, just reading studies and research and other information on working with respondents to try to inform their work. In terms of interventions used, we kind of saw those as existing on this spectrum from respondent support to respondent services. And so a colleague on this research study put this as, you know, if we're on more of the support side, we're kind of treating them as students paying tuition that are owed services like counseling because they're customers of the institution, versus the support side where we're really digging in more into those philosophies around you're a human worthy of empathy, I'm invested in your growth, learning, etc. And I want to acknowledge that for a lot of our participants, they may have been doing both of these. They weren't necessarily just on one side of the spectrum. Um, on that side of respondent support, we saw a lot of psychosocial education. And again, I talked about how sometimes this was really formal, like maybe schools had a program like STARSA where it was like, okay, you're now being referred to this person who's going to engage in XYZ sessions with you for this STARSA intervention versus maybe just this happening through more informal conversations in an ongoing relationship of meeting with and working with that respondent. Um, and there were kind of three themes that emerged in this psychosocial support side of things. So one was helping students reflect on their personal experiences with trauma. And Piper talks about this. She says, a lot of times people who commit who commit harm have trauma themselves. I've heard a lot of respondents say, I was sexually assaulted, or I didn't realize that that counted as sexual assault. Like that happened to me before. Um, so that also, I think, kind of ties into that earlier quote from Gray around oftentimes the respondents have some healing of their own that they may need to do and work through. And as you heard in some of the earlier quotes, there's also a lot of working with respondents to help them reflect on their socialization and how that's maybe influenced or impacted the behavior or harm that they engaged in. And so TJ says, I will typically ask questions that are probably questions they've never been asked before, like, how do you define consent for yourself? Because you're also allowed to practice consent. You can ask to receive consent, but you can also give consent. So, what does that look like for you? And this specific student that I'm thinking of, they'd never thought about it for themselves. As someone who's a male, he'd assumed that that's not something he needs to do, like practice consent for yourself. And I've asked questions like, who taught you about this? Who talked to you about consent? Is that a conversation that you had with people, like maybe your parents or family member or somebody? But just letting them know, like, once you can identify consent for yourself, it becomes easier to give consent or ask for consent when you're interacting with other people. And then a final theme that emerged from the folks who were engaging in psychosocial education was helping the respondent take on the perspective of perhaps the person they harmed or others, and also giving the respondent a perspective on their behavior. Sometimes it was the practitioner working with the respondent saying, well, let me tell you what I'm seeing and thinking based on what you shared with me. And so I've got a couple quotes from Lisa and another participant to illustrate this. Lisa says, I was having a conversation with someone once, and there was a fixation on the other party's unwillingness to give this person a second chance. He really wanted an opportunity to explain himself and to apologize, and she just wasn't giving him the time of day to do that. And I said, she doesn't owe you anything. And in that moment, just like facial expression changed. He sat up in his seat and kind of put his elbows on his knees for a second. Normally, I would not be so blunt in a conversation, but we'd had a few meetings, so we had some rapport, and I knew that this was like a little bit more of his style. So I went for it in the moment of stating a true statement. I got to really see the puzzle pieces kind of connect, with each other. And it got us on a really valuable conversation about entitlement and what are the factors that can contribute to this. And then Elizabeth similarly talks about helping a student take on a perspective of perhaps the person he harmed and maybe some how others might have felt in that moment too, had they been in the shoes of the person who was harmed. So Elizabeth says, I worked with a student um, who came in hot. He was upset at the university. It was very much a conversation of like, I deserve to be treated with respect. And yes, I slammed down my weights and called her a mean word in the gym. And there was this moment of, if there's going to be an investigation or not, or kind of both de-escalating and allowing him to feel heard. So Elizabeth's talking about she had this respondent who had this incident in a weight room, and then was upset that he was kind of in trouble for this incident and being called in to meet with her and others at the university. So I'll continue with Elizabeth's quote. Liza said, offering the perspective, I was like, hey, can I offer you a different perspective? If you had raised your voice to me like that and threw down weights, I would be scared. As a woman, I would be scared that you're going to hurt me. And your intention was like, of course you wouldn't hurt her. But how does she know that when this happens to a lot of women who don't know what a man has said and they see on the news that someone was hurt because of it or killed? And he was like, yeah, that's true. I probably really scared her. And I was like, and that word that you used is usually used when a woman isn't complying with what you've told them to do. And do you see what the reaction might be like? And he owned it. He was like, I shouldn't have done that. I need to figure out how to express my frustration differently. And I was like, how can we do that? So you see how Liz's or Elizabeth's offering of kind of perspective, that student was able to take it on, and it's hopefully leading to a moment of growth and learning. Okay. So more on the respondent services side of things, we have themes around, as we discussed earlier, kind of discussing definitions and policy with the students, making sure they're understanding a process, perhaps helping them reintegrate following a formal Title IX or conduct process. Um, and Sean talks about this, how there's some, just like reviewing definitions with folks and helping them see their behavior through that lens. Sean says, sometimes they may not agree with all that's being alleged, but they recognize, like, yeah, I screwed up here. I don't think I did this, but I think I did this. Um, And so it's like this is about critical thinking, about like where do you think you may have caused harm, or where do you think you may have crossed that line into what's considered a violation? I've seen a spectrum of reactions to it, but some of the ones that tend to hit home more are the ones where they realize that their behavior wasn't only a violation of rules, but a violation of their values. So as you can see too with that quote, I think this doesn't just always again fit neatly into, oh, I'm doing pure respondent services, because in that conversation, we're getting them to see their behavior through the lens of this policy and this definition, but it sounds like it's also leading to some deeper reflection on personal values, again, which is hopefully going to prompt some growth. So I want to pause for a second. And again, if you haven't done the polls in the chat, there are, or I'm sorry, the Whova polls, there's some where I'm also asking like, does your school offer services? Who carries out that work? What types of interventions are used? And then this is more of a, you can answer in the chat because I don't think I could neatly encapsulate this in a poll. But what are maybe for those of y'all who have schools that are working with respondents, what are some of the philosophies that you think are guiding these interventions? You know, are you hearing these conversations through a lens of kind of equity? Because we offer XYZ for survivors or complainants, so we need to offer XYZ for respondents. Are there themes around growth and learning, or is this more of a we're here to just kind of make sure they get through this process and they understand these policies? You know, are people coming at this through a lens around, you know, seeing the humanity in every kind of student, including respondents? So I'm just going to take a second to look at the poll. Majority of y'all are saying 82% are saying that your school does offer services for respondents. So I'm really glad to hear that, because I do think there's huge value in this work. And then in terms of where it's housed, kind of similar to what we found in our study, it's a variety of places. 53% of people are saying it's a dean of students or student conduct office. 65%, I think this was one where you could check multiple, are saying it's happening in a Title IX office. 18% are saying a student support or case management office. About 22% are saying a sexual assault prevention or response office. And then we've also got 17% of y'all who are saying other, which doesn't surprise me. And I'd be curious if you want to put in the chat like what that other is. Just because I think, again, this work can be housed in very different places on campus. And then the final question I had was what kind of interventions are folks using? And let me see what those results look like. And this was one where folks could check multiple. So, 53% of people are saying they're doing some form of psychosocial education. About 20% are saying they're doing some sort of formal reintegration program. 67% are saying that, just went up a little. 69% are saying they're doing some discussions around policy, definitions, maybe process. And then 56% are saying other. And again, if y'all want to put in the chat that other, I'm interested. Um, and I'm seeing someone in the chat who's saying they're housed in a university's Office of Wellbeing. That is a new one for me, but that makes sense to me. I can see how that fits there as well. So again, just interesting to see that this is happening in different places on campus. And I'm seeing someone who's saying I'm in a Title IX office and we're more focused on equity, guiding someone through the process. And as someone who works in a Title IX office, that makes sense to me why that would be kind of that lens. And there are some growth and learning opportunities when the survivor and respondent both opt into that approach through an agreement-based resolution. Yes. Nora, I was just on the session about how schools are doing informal resolutions, and it was really interesting to hear about how other schools are structuring that. And I think a lot of us are really happy when we're able to kind of facilitate those processes where hopefully both students are coming to an agreement and maybe there's some healing or growth or learning that's coming out of that agreement. Feel free to keep putting stuff in the chat, y'all. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on it. And I've also got Melissa and Liz and Latanya who are here kind of helping me keep an eye on things if y'all put something in there that I miss. Okay, so just a couple more things to chat with y'all about. Last piece of findings are the context that we found for this work. You know, we not surprisingly, there were a lot of challenges with this work. One of those was around kind of the shifting policy landscape and the compliance culture that kind of goes along with that, particularly around the Title IX regulations. And we heard a lot of desire for change in this process. And so I'm going to dive a little deeper into what some of those challenges and supports that people noted were. So we found that supervisors and colleagues, it kind of depended on the participant. For some participants, these were a huge source of support, and for some participants, these were a real form of a challenge for them. I'll start with a quote from Lisa, who found this as a place of support. Lisa says, I have the privilege of feeling very supported in what I do. I've got a fantastic team of folks that I work with. I have an incredible supervisor that I report to directly that understands and really values the work that we do here. And he also provides me with a good amount of freedom in how I want to execute our program and really looks to me as the expert on the work that we do here. Um, so again, in Lisa's case, having that supportive, the boss who gets the work and gives her kind of the latitude, is a positive. But we also heard from people who were like, I have colleagues who just don't get what I do, and that is a real hindrance for my work. Um, we also heard from a lot of folks that the importance of having kind of colleagues or folks that you can turn to for support to help you kind of process this work, whether that's consulting or kind of brainstorming. And especially because one of the themes that you've hopefully picked up on is there's not a clear roadmap for this work. So having respected and trusted colleagues that you can go to and kind of bounce ideas off or vent to or brainstorm with was really valuable for folks. And I've got a quote from Quillen to illustrate this. Quillen said, I think where support is manifested is I've always felt comfortable in consultation with my case management peers. We've created an environment within our office where admitting that you don't know something doesn't mean you are a bad professional or that you should have come more prepared. There's no onus of guilt that falls on someone who doesn't understand how a policy works or who to communicate with, or maybe a student asked something that was really confusing and you don't understand. We have a weekly recurring I messed up kind of meeting. So for an hour, we just go around and talk about the cases we're really struggling with, or that maybe things didn't go super well. And it's a space where we're always meeting each other with humility and compassion. Whether it's coming from a peer or even a supervisor, I don't feel afraid to ask or to say, I think I messed something up, um, or I don't think I fully understood a situation. And then we had another participant, JC, who said, I don't really have like folks on campus that kind of get me and get my role. But our state coalition facilitates a space for the folks at different universities who are doing respondent work to connect. And so JC said, I've got a quote. I don't feel like I necessarily have that within my reporting line, but we do have a system-wide monthly phone call where it's the respondent support people from all across the state's campuses. So I do get support from that group. So yes, I do feel supported, but it's in a different ways from different people. Um, and then Rocky talked about how colleagues at different institutions through their kind of professional association has been a big source of support. Rocky said, there's the fact that I've been part of ASCA for 20 years and I know people there. There's practically no one there that won't take my call, and there are plenty of people who call me. So thankfully, folks are finding ways to find support, even if it's maybe they're not finding it on their campus. They have other networks that they're able to get that through. Um, but again, I said there are folks out there who feel like their institution maybe just doesn't fully get this work and get what they're doing. Sadie said, I guess I don't feel unsupported, which is not the same as saying I feel supported, right? Um, Yvonne also said, I feel very much supported as an individual doing the work. However, what doesn't feel supportive is when institutions don't understand the scope of the work that we do institutionally. I haven't yet felt super strong support for building Title IX offices. Um, that's where I felt in my career it's been lacking. Like, yeah, we need Title IX because we know we have to have a coordinator because we have to be compliant. But what do you mean you need more staff? Or do you need more support if you've only had 4 investigations this year? And so, in some ways, I'm hoping that I could move up enough in an organization to really advocate for compliance. And not just for compliance sake, but using compliance as sort of a jumping off point for providing more people and staff to support people in these processes. Um, and Joe talked about just straight up not feeling supported when they were in their role. Joe said, I did not feel supported in that role in higher ed. I think that people were grateful. I think that I was doing this work, and other people were like, I don't know if I want to do that. So thank God Joe will talk to these kids because I certainly don't want to. I think the lack of support was they would do things policy wise that were reflexively about respondent equity that was a little bit disconnected. They were performing respondent equity without necessarily connecting that to respondent needs. And so the lack of support was actually a broader lack of support for the work as a whole, specifically wanting to do things at a surface perception level, not at a deeper invest to do the work properly. Um, and this kind of ties into this context around, the current federal policies like Title IX and how much those align with our values, as institutions of higher education and with the values of the folks doing this work. It was a very consistent theme that Title IX regs changing, and especially with all the stuff we went through in 2024, with those regs being implemented briefly in some states and being under an injunction in other states, and then getting struck down at the beginning of 2025. Not to mention everything going on with case law and state regulations. It just creates a really confusing and overwhelming landscape for the professionals. And then if the professionals are feeling that, it's even harder to kind of help students understand that and walk them through that. Um, and so we definitely had a theme from participants around like um folks not always interpreting the Title IX regs in the same way in terms of what it allows us to do or not do with respondents, and in terms of things like informal resolutions and restorative justice. And so I have a quote from Piper to illustrate that. Piper said, I went to this NASPA conference and I went to a lot of restorative justice presentations, and I met this one individual who worked at another college in my region, and they were like, how are you able to do this program? Like, confidential employees aren't allowed to do this. And I was like, well, I think we're allowed to do certain pieces of this, so why don't we find those gray areas and work within those? But it's just this huge fear of, are we going to get in trouble for doing it? So that's kind of a constraint on this work, is folks don't always understand what we're allowed to do and not allowed to do under the regs. And maybe you're afraid that doing work with respondents is in some ways going to run afoul of those regs. Um, you know, we had someone, Desiree, who said, no matter how many big-hearted, empathetic patient professionals sit on one side of the table, at some point the system may dictate what's possible. And Joe, in talking about the current regulation, said there's just nothing about this process that encourages any kind of genuine accountability taking. Kevin highlighted, I don't think either party ends up leaving satisfied or feeling good about the process, referring to these Title IX processes, the formal process. And Sean said our North Star is federal and state compliance. Um, so that is just a big challenge that comes with this work. Um, and it can influence the effectiveness of these respondent interventions, right? Piper talks about how the current regulations and the compliance landscape can instill fear in respondents. We saw themes around it can also create confusion for them. Some of the rhetoric around Title IX that's in the news and online can also kind of create some fear or confusion for folks, or make them distrustful of offices on campus and the processes. And this can lead to these processes feeling ineffective, unfortunately. A lot of folks talked about how lengthy the Title IX process is, and how they just felt like it wasn't serving either the victim slash complainant or the respondent, the student who had been accused. Um, so I've got some quotes here that just kind of illustrate some of these stressors. Kendra said, I feel so stressed whenever a student asks me a question. My supervisor is so risk averse, and anytime a student asks me a question, her answer is always to refer to the policy. Don't give your own answer. Always refer to the policy. Sit right there with the student, look it up, find it on the policy, point at it. And so when a student has questions, I find myself feeling very stressed because I know that I'm going to have to take time to look up every single answer. And some of their questions are not easily answerable. So again, that theme around like, we've got to comply. We're so afraid of what happens if we don't comply. And we're afraid to go, outside of our lane, a very narrow lane, for fear of kind of saying the wrong thing or getting in trouble. Um, and, another participant, Sadie, talked about how the 2020 regulations creating a bifurcated process created a lot of challenges for them and their community. So a lot of colleges, because the 2020 regulations narrowed Title IX and that policy just to incidents that were happening on campus or at a small handful of off-campus locations, they now have one policy for the Title IX cases that fall under those regs and another policy for sexual misconduct cases that fall outside of that. So you could have two sexual assaults that have a very similar set of facts, that are going to have two different processes because one occurred on campus in a residence hall and the other occurred off campus at a private residence. And then Rocky talked about just how challenging it is with not only balancing the federal Title IX regulations, but also possibly state regulations or laws, and keeping up with what's happening in court cases, because that can have bearing on our specific campuses. So Rocky said, we have legislators who think they know what the hell they're doing, and they don't. They believe in the superiority of the American criminal justice system, and therefore anybody who's doing anything other is not doing justice to people. So let's write a procedure that is completely contrary to the philosophy of most educational institutions. Then there are different districts. There are different federal districts. There are different circuit courts of appeal that are making different decisions. You're going to get a different decision in the Ninth Circuit, California, Utah, than you will in the Sixth Circuit, than you will in the Fifth Circuit. So it's not only is it a matter of you have state legislatures trying to tell administration, here's what you need to do. You have different courts that are making different decisions. And so that becomes an even bigger problem because not only do you have administrators that are trying to keep up with what they're supposed to do today in terms of regulations, what is our state telling us? What are our judicial jurisdictions telling us? Whether it's state court, whether it's federal court, circuit courts of appeal. And now you need to know what the Ninth Circuit did, even though you're in the Second Circuit. And so you have this giant tornado of information circling around. I really like that imagery from Rocky of, I can affirm it sometimes does feel like there is a giant tornado of information, in terms of regulations and that drive to keep up compliance with what we need to be doing. Morgan also talked about this impact of the rhetoric around Title IX. Morgan said, and I also have several different supportive documents that we've created to help students understand, like, what is going on? You said federal regulations. Am I being investigated by the government? So, not always understanding what those federal regulations mean. Summer said, it's so interesting how the national attention, how people don't really understand it. And so if you don't understand it and then you get called in for a Title IX meeting, you're like, what does this mean? Because as a respondent, they see the news and they're like, well, Title IX is survivor centered and I'm already guilty. And then survivors say, well, all the people I've seen, they're taking away the rights of survivors. So students on both sides are seeing, rhetoric around Title IX that's making them think the process is not going to be fair to them or is not going to serve them or meet their needs. Um, and then, several of the participants again talked about how this felt ineffective. Yvonne said, we've just been trained to follow the rules and not get fined, and we've not been given the credence as institutions by the Department of Ed to determine how do we address this form of violence. Do we even understand what it is? And I think that we don't, because we've been enforcing these punitive means. And I think if you just ask the average student, most people will say, I just want them to stop. I want them to know what happened and how it's affected me. And we've been forced into these modes of adjudication that really don't serve either student or either party. And I want to highlight, earlier, I think last month, I posted like a discussion question in the community around like what are the needs folks hear from survivors in relation to respondents? And a lot of folks hit on that piece that Yvonne's talking about here of survivors want the respondent to stop the behavior. They want them to know what's happened and how it's affected them, right? But Yvonne's saying these current Title IX processes are not effective for achieving those goals. Um, Similarly, Christina said, especially I think because students often don't want the harsh accountability that universities are required to do when we go down that path. Like, I understand the framing of Title IX and where we're going and the fact that we need to protect public safety, but realistically, when I talk to most people, they don't necessarily want the person gone or to get into trouble. They just want that to not happen to anyone else. And I think because our systems are so rigid, it's really hard to balance in the current environment public safety with prevention and support. It feels like public safety is always the one that wins. But I think if there were other options of like lower education response conversations, like a lot of smaller things that kind of go unreported that are creating this larger rape culture, we could actually get worked out and talk about. Um, so again, you're hearing that theme from Christina of these current Title IX processes are just not meeting the needs that survivors are expressing to us, much less, helping respondents engage in that kind of, accountability and learning and growth and healing that a lot of folks are saying that they want to see from them. I've got a final quote here from Bell. I've also gone through an entire process where we've done an investigation and it's taken close to 3 months to get the entire investigation finished. And then we come to the point where we're ready to schedule a hearing. And at that point, the person who is harmed says, I want this to be done. It's taken way too long. I'm over this. I don't want to move forward this, but I want to make sure that you still hold this person accountable. And it's like, we can't do that unless we have a formal process. Um, so it becomes really difficult that we put people through such a long process without the opportunity to have a level of accountability and education. So just to check in, y'all can put this in the chat. I saw already Liz said, I agree with so much with that. It feels like all or nothing. Do these contexts resonate with you? Are there challenges that your school has faced in this work? Or maybe you can share some good stuff too. Are there some successes? And I'll just say personally, while I'm waiting to see if anyone puts anything in the chat, a lot of this resonates with me. Working in a Title IX office, I definitely have to be the one to make sure we are complying with Title IX. But often it does feel like that formal, Title IX investigation and hearing process, it's kind of inherently setting students up for an adversarial process. And when that process is adversarial, for me, it feels like we're less likely to get kind of those pieces around meeting those survivor needs around accountability and being heard, and that other person, acknowledging the harm that they've done, or seeing that growth and change in the respondent to where we feel some hope that they're not going to do this to anyone else. So again, just feel free to put in the chat if there are challenges or successes that you've had that you want to share from your campus, or just if there's pieces of this, those contacts that are really resonating with you. Okay, so let's talk about then what this research, what are some of the implications we found for our practice and kind of terms of next steps for this field. We really felt like this research did point to a need to engage more with policymakers and legislators. And I know that's easier said than done, but trying to make sure that we have a voice when decisions are being made about these policies, to understand what the actual needs are on our campus, what we're seeing from our students, is important. And thank you. I see Nora saying, I definitely relate to feeling like it's all or nothing, either a formal process or no follow-up, because we're limited in how we can engage with respondents. It's also hard to disappoint survivors when we can't meet their hopes and make effective change. And yes, I think that resonates with me, Nora. I think that's one of the hardest pieces for me personally is when we're working with a survivor. And they're asking for things that I think are reasonable for a survivor to ask for. Again, like I want this person to know how they harmed me. And I want to know that they're not going to do this to someone else. And we don't always feel like we have the tools to get there with our respondents. particularly because of some of the constraints maybe that these policies are creating. So again, trying to make sure that those voices are being heard, both the voices of survivors and their wants and needs, but also the voices of folks who are actually doing this work on campus when we're engaging or when there's policy and legislation that's being discussed. We also really noted we need more spaces for professional development for folks who are working with respondents and professional development spaces that aren't just rooted in compliance. Um, so like more education and training around understanding why folks engage in harmful behavior. Um, More training on kind of understanding and examining survivors' needs, like what are they looking for from respondents and in these processes, because we've always got to center. I know I just gave this long talk that was all centered on respondents, but at the root of this is we're trying to center survivor needs, and what they need to heal from the harm that's been done to them. Um, and then again, you heard this theme coming up a lot that oftentimes what's needed for a respondent to maybe be able to say the things that the survivor needs to hear or to take in the things that the survivor needs them to understand, or to change the behaviors that led to the harm occurring in the first place. We need the respondent to be able to heal. And so hopefully in centering a survivor's needs for healing, we can also center some healing for the respondent in a way that's going to be responsive to what the survivor needs. And then finally, we need places for creative problem solving because, as you've heard, there's really not like a clear roadmap for doing this work right now. And so, more spaces where the folks who are doing this work or who want to do this work can kind of engage and brainstorm. And kind of talk through the challenges and the successes are really valuable spaces for folks, and we don't kind of have enough of those existing right now. Um, the last kind of big theme I want to talk about is this framing around accountability versus punishment. And this comes from Surad's work in 2019. But we really saw these themes coming out around folks wanting to see processes that prioritize accountability. And I do want to acknowledge, we when I posted that question in the community about what needs are folks hearing from survivors, there were a lot of needs I saw that fell into this accountability side of things, but there were also some that center around punishment. And I'm not here to put a value judgment on if a survivor is coming from that place. Although what I suspect is that a lot of times, even when we hear survivors expressing needs that are maybe sounding more to us like punishment, like I want this person expelled from campus, there's probably a need in there from that survivor around things like safety, feeling safe in their community, right? Um, but Sured makes this differentiation between accountability and punishment. Um, Accountability is something that a person chooses to do, and it requires that person to enact and repair by transforming themselves to not engage in other harm or further harm. Whereas punishment is enacted on a person by someone or something else, like a, criminal justice system or our Title IX regulations, perhaps. And it aims to diminish the power of the person who caused harm. So punishment is more focused on the suffering of the person who caused the harm, rather than allowing natural consequences to motivate repair of harm, like we would see on the accountability side. So accountability requires ongoing self-work and responsibility to learning about oneself to prevent further harm from happening. Um, and we just don't get that in punishment, right? Like punishment severs relationships and connection, it fosters shame and isolation. And we know that relationships and connection are actually really important for folks to be able to engage in work around healing and growth and learning and changing their behavior. Um, so this is definitely a framework that I think informs our work going forward. Um, And so, I'm seeing I've got 5 minutes left. That is perfect. I'm really proud of myself for timing this so well. Um, I just last thing, if y'all want to put anything in the chat about kind of other implications you see for our work. or just any final thoughts. I'm going to give a couple minutes for that in the chat. And then I'm going to close out with just a minute or two of a grounding exercise, since I think the theme of self-care and taking care of ourselves that this conference really emphasizes is important and one that I want to reinforce for y'all. So again, I'll just give another minute or two. You can respond to this question about implications you see for our work with respondents, or just any other thoughts that this research and presentation has brought up for y'all. And at the very least, for those of y'all who are grappling with this on your campus, I hope some of this was validating. Like, I hope you see yourself in this research. Liz is saying, I think my institution can definitely do a better job of filling in that gray area between a formal process and no formal report. And yes, Liz, I think that's something I know we've certainly been grappling with at our institution, is trying to build up more of those options that allow for more informal resolution between two students. And hope, yes, very glad to see that it was validating. I know personally when I was kind of when we were getting into some of the research themes and results, I was doing a lot of like, yes, 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 yes. Like I certainly see myself in a lot of this too, even though I wasn't one of the research participants. All right, y'all. Well, I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna just close. Oh, wait, let me see, Melissa. Yeah, leveraging protective factors and addressing trauma and past harms with respondents. I think that's definitely really important. And I know there's some spaces that are starting to crop up for us to kind of talk more about what those factors are and leverage that. All right, I think I have 2 minutes left. So as I promised, I'm going to just do a brief kind of grounding exercise to close us out. And I've got up here a picture of Ottoman Park here in New Orleans, which is right across the street from our campus. So I'm really lucky that on days when the weather is nice, I like to go walk around the park either at lunchtime or after work, spend some time in nature, get some movement in, maybe put on some music I like or a good audio book. And so I'm going to invite you. You can either visualize Audubon Park. It's beautiful and sunny here today in New Orleans. This is probably about what the park looks like today, or focus on kind of another image that feels safe and calming for you. But first, let's begin by taking a slow, deep breath in through your nose and gently exhale through your mouth. Let's do that again. Inhale deeply, feeling your lungs expand. And exhale slowly, letting go of any tension. Continue breathing at your own pace, noticing the rhythm of your breath. And if your mind wanders, gently bring your attention back to your breathing. Now imagine a place where you feel completely safe and at peace. It could be a quiet beach, a forest, a cozy room, anywhere that feels comforting to you. Picture yourself there and notice the details, the colors, the sounds, the textures. Feel the ground beneath you in this place. Take a moment to breathe in the air of this space, whether it's fresh, warm, or crisp, and let that sense of calm fill you. As you continue to breathe, remind yourself that you can return to this peaceful place anytime you need. When you're ready, gently bring your awareness back to the room, wiggle your fingers and toes, take one last deep breath, and open your eyes. And I'm just going to close with, I'll make sure I put this on the info for the page, but you can check out the info on this research and get contact info for us on the McCluskey Center website. But thank you all so much.
Thank you, Julia, so much for this valuable information and the research that continues to grow. We need this information in order to end violence. So thank you so much. Thank you all for attending. Please continue the self-care and join us at 3:15, and then have a wonderful day. Thanks so much, everyone.